everyone. Welcome to the September 20th edition of the TimeformUS forecast. I'm David Aragona. My usual co-host Craig Milkowski is still taking a couple weeks off. I'm hoping to have Craig back next week. Last time I spoke to him, he was hopeful that he might be able to rejoin me for next week. So looking forward to having Craig back soon. But for this week, happy to have a guest on to help me handicap some weekend races. Gino Buccola, who I've talked to quite a bit on his podcast, the That's What G Said podcast. He's had me on as a guest a few times, and I always enjoy talking to Gino. I've got to chat with him a little bit more recently now that he's a DRF contributor. But Gino, welcome to the podcast, and I'm excited to handicap this Parx Saturday Pick-5 with you.
Yeah, a little role reversal here. It's very nice to be joining you. I listen to you and Craig quite often. I was listening last week with you and Emily when she filled in. She's one of my favorite people to talk racing with also. You had a great start. You had Carson's run right off the bat to get the Woodbine Pick-5 started, which meant that you already had a better than your entire Saratoga meet with your TimeformUS highlight horses, who seemed like they ran second every single time. It was almost so funny, David. I was paying attention a lot more to those highlight horses this year because I've been doing some work with DRF on the social media side. Just a little bit of a tangent before we even started. Isn't it? It's almost funny when we get in those stretches in gambling where it seemed like every horse that you had was running second or like running really well and finishing second. And like usually at good odds, you're not putting up heavy chalks as your highlight horses. So I was glad to see that you got a nice winner and got started at Woodbine last weekend.
Yeah, it's funny how that works out sometimes. I mean, it should be random, but it does feel like you just get into those streaks sometimes where every good opinion is finishing second or third, and that's how a lot of the Saratoga meet went for me. And we're actually going to talk about a couple of the highlight horses in this Pick-5 that ran second very early in the meet, just kind of got things rolling in that direction. But yeah, I mean, when you're going in one of those streaks, you feel like, oh, I'm wasting my good opinions, because you always feel as a handicapper like you only have so many good opinions, and you can't be right about everything. And when they keep finishing second, it's just like, oh, it's these wasted opportunities, and it's a sickening feeling. But inevitably, when you're playing this game long enough, you're playing the long game, and it's going to turn around.
Exactly. You know, the process is there. It's just like you said, it's frustrating because those are the times you're supposed to capitalize. What's the great quote in like 21? You know, the house is going to win. It's a little different in horse racing, but you know you're going to get so many of those days that are your days. And when you have those 5, 8, 10 to 1 shots running second and running well, it's like, oh, that probably was one of my days that I really needed to capitalize on. So let's see if this weekend at Parx can be one of our days, David.
Well, Gino, I wanted to have you on the podcast because, like I said, I mean, I've been on your podcast a few times to handicap some big days. And the thing that I always enjoy talking to you is that you're always so prepared, and you're a good handicapper. And whenever we have conversations, you always have done the work, and it's easy to have a conversation with somebody who's obviously done a ton of work on the races as well. So I'm looking forward to handicapping the sequence with you. And we're going to be talking about the Philly Big 5, and it will be a mandatory payout on Saturday. It is typically a jackpot wager, but Parx has announced that it's going to be a regular Pick-5 on Saturday with a carryover. I haven't looked up exactly what that total is. I think it'll be determined after Wednesday. We're recording this pretty early on Wednesday morning, but it is races 10 through 14 on Saturday at Parx, which of course includes the feature race, the Grade 1 Pennsylvania Derby, and a couple Grade 1s on this card, including the Cotillion. Begins with the Parx Dirt Mile, runs on through the Gallant Bob, and then things end with a pretty confusing allowance optional claimer to close things out. So it's not an easy sequence, and it's one where I think there are going to be some significant favorites, but perhaps ones that we can take some shots against.
Yeah, and I think it's a good group a good sequence as far as we have a couple races with some really nice star horses. I think the Cotillion came up pretty strong, and then as far as the Pennsylvania Derby, a couple nice horses in there. Didn't really have the top tier of the 3-year-olds, but still a really nice sort of later developing horse in Saudi Crown, who we'll get to. I thought the sequence is really fun to get a chance to get some different style races. We'll go a mile on the dirt and that Parx Dirt Mile right off the bat. We'll see, some good horses in the 2 and the 3-year-old rankings. And even earlier on the card, there are some nice, turf races. If you're a fan of that, there's even some strength on the undercard before the Pick-5 sequence. So not someone who is playing Parx day in, day out anymore. I used to watch it a little bit more and pay attention a little bit more when I was on TVG, and I'm dating myself now. We were back at Philly Parx in Philadelphia back then. But yeah, it's a really good sequence, this Pick-5, and there are some strong races even before that.
Yeah, before we get into the handicapping, we should note that just looking at the forecast 3 days ahead, it does seem like there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be rain on Saturday. We'll see how that affects some of the turf racing earlier on. I think there are just 2 races, both the stakes races, carded for the turf before the Philly Big 5 sequence begins. The entire Pick-5 is carded for the dirt, so we'll see if it's a fast track or more likely some kind of wet track. We'll see how much rain they get on Saturday. But it does seem like the forecast is kind of solidifying around some kind of rainy day. So just keep that in mind when you're assessing the horse's form as we go through this sequence. Well, Gino, let's get right into the handicapping, and we're going to kick off this sequence with the Parx Dirt Mile. This is a 2-turn mile race for the 4 and up runners. 7 signed on, 6 males, and we do have the mare, Dr. B, entered in the outside post position. But obviously, the big name in this race is the number 5, Gunite, who a bit of a surprise entrant in here. I wonder if this is tipping the hand of the connections a little bit, that they're going to look maybe more towards the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile once again, rather than the Dirt Sprint. When Breeders' Cup time rolls around, obviously Steve Asmussen has some sprinting power in his barn right now, so I'd imagine he'd want to split up the runners a little bit, having 2 really fast fillies in the stable in Echo Zulu and Society. So we'll see what he decides to do with these horses around Breeders' Cup time, but apparently Gunite's going to stretch out to the 2 turns here, and it's one of those situations where I don't think anybody's going to dispute that Gunite has the best form coming into this race, but this might not be his ideal distance just based on his prior attempts going the mile. So how short a price do you want to take on a favorite that is maybe going a trip that's not his ideal?
Yeah, when you're seeing horses like this, Gunite in this particular spot, I'm curious because I think going a mile, his best trip would be the type of trip he had last time out, just on the front end. Because I'm not sure if he really wants to sit a trip going this long. We saw him try to do that in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile last year. It wasn't as if he ran poorly. He finished 4th behind a couple quality horses in Cody's Wish, Cyberknife, and Slow Down Andy. The thing is he's not really one of those types of horses, David, who's been want to get to the lead and be really fast early. He seems like he's very content in sitting off another horse or two, kind of having a target. I think last time was because of the way that race was, where it really on paper looked like it was him and Elite Power, and he wanted to try to get that advantage and get the jump on him. See, he's not like that runoff type speed horse, and if he were to try to do that in here, I think there might be a couple other horses who could put a little pressure on him and make him work. So I'm intrigued by a couple others who might be able to sit off the speeds. I do think the presence of Nimitz Class with Paco Lopez aboard signals to me that they may want to get a little more aggressive than he's been in perhaps his last couple, where he sat off, maybe got a little farther back and a little comfortable and wasn't able to reel in the horses in races where he was heavily favored. A lot of times when I'm handicapping and I see horses that are speedy and maybe they don't get to the lead in 1 or 2 races in a row, I feel like they will kind of be determined to get there and be forwardly placed in here. I think Nimitz Class is a real key to this race. And then also a horse like Mish. Mish is not slow. Both of those horses could really push Gunite. And maybe I'm projecting that I'm hoping it's those 2 horses, David, based on the horses that I like, because I want those 2 to be the 2 doing the dirty work and making Gunite work a little bit. I actually think the mare is somewhat intriguing to the outside, Dr. B. And this is a horse who I think you had pointed out in one of your highlight horses at some point. She chased Echo Zulu in her last 2 races. So if we're comparing some of those Asmussen top tier sprinters, Echo Zulu earned, I believe, a 112 buyer in her last 2 wins in back-to-back races. One of those was a muddy track that Dr. B was on. And it's just so hard to be chasing a filly like that. I don't think anyone in here has that type of runaway speed where if she's chasing, it's going to take as much out of her. She's a mare now that really does intrigue me a little bit because she's capable of running a big race. We saw her do so at a mile, and I think she can maybe sit a trip and kind of fall into a good spot. If Gunite gets beat, I think she would be one of the type of horses who would kind of benefit from the trip that beats Gunite.
Yeah, she's an interesting entrant in here for a couple of reasons. I mean, you were highlighting the fact that she's just been in some really tough spots recently, and you could argue this is actually a slight class drop coming out of that ballerina. I mean, when you compare the depth of that race to the Forgo that was run on the same card, which was won by Gunite, I mean, you can argue whether Gunite and Elite Power are better horses than Echo Zulu and Goodnight Olive, but the clock says that the ballerina was just a faster race. So her losing that race by a dozen lengths, especially when you're looking at the TimeformUS speed figures, she doesn't get that much lower of a number than Gunite did winning the Forgo, and part of that's due to the pace and the competition and how fast they had to run that day. But you could definitely make the argument that Dr. B is coming out of some really tough spots. When I first started handicapping this race, I was all ready to dismiss her because, as you kind of alluded to, I've been burned by her a little bit this year. I liked her when she was a big price earlier on, and she just disappointed me in a couple of those races. But it turns out those were some really tough spots, and she does have that win going back to the Go for Wand at Aqueduct in December over a sloppy track, going the mile distance when she ran the best race of her career, when she could be finding herself in a similar situation, albeit against a tougher field on Saturday. So I'm not as against her as I thought I was going to be when I initially started handicapping this race. It sounds like you still probably like her a little more than I do, but given the fact that she's going to be a price in here, I do want to keep more of an open mind about her. And with a horse like Gunite, just to kind of wrap him up, I mean, I just think in general, you want to be a little skeptical of horses that are going to get bet down off wins last time out, that just look super obvious on paper, that are trying something new and have to prove that they can do something they've never done before. So, he's 2-1 on the line. I would imagine he's going to go off much shorter than that, just given the reputation and the speed figures. The one thing I'll say that he does have working in his favor is it's just kind of a weird thing, the way that they've decided to weight this race. I guess there's allowance weighting, and I imagine that horses that have prior to turn or maybe mile or route form are being penalized more, and Gunite doesn't have that. So it's just kind of a weird thing where he's actually getting weight from the horses that are maybe his three main rivals, and here he's carrying less weight than them. So you don't generally see that with a horse that's regarded as the horse to beat, but it's just kind of a funny thing with the way the weights have worked out in this race. So I guess that he does have that working in his favor, but I still want to be a little against him here. I took a long look at Nimit's class. It just feels like his form has gone south a little bit. I wanted to see him finish a little better, especially last time when he was beaten by Bylad and say, who's a solid Pennsylvania bred, but I mean, it just feels like he's lost some of that spark that he had earlier in this season. And Mish, I mean, I agree with you that he's a horse that I think is most likely to go forward in this race and be mixing it up on the front end, but I didn't think he had a big excuse last time in the Russell Road when he sort of had things go his way on the front end and just got beaten by a horse
track too.
Yeah, and just got beaten by a horse that I personally wouldn't like that much in here. So I wanted to go looking in some other directions, as it sounded like you did, and it does feel like there's the potential for this race to come apart a little bit. What do you make of a horse like the number 2, Dr. Ardito, who's coming in for Chad Brown, the New York bred, who's just a really honest sort who always gives a game try?
Yeah, I think if you're trying to beat Gunite, the next tier of horses would be Dr. Ardito and Wheel and Springs. That would definitely be in my radar. And honestly, I don't have much to knock on either one of them. Dr. Ardito is a really honest New York bred. And from a speed figure standpoint, he's remarkably consistent, right? You feel like you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to get from him. He'll be making second start off a short little break, so he might even have the ability to step a little bit forward. And if we're playing this race trying to beat Gunite, we're probably thinking that Gunite and maybe one or two others go a little too quick early on in here. Dr. Ardito would absolutely be one of the horses to benefit from that. If you're playing the filly Pick-5, I will probably have a single in one of these races, so Dr. Ardito will be in the mix for me in here, no doubt about it, and probably will Wheel and Springs. But you know Dr. Ardito well. He's run some good races at Saratoga, Belmont, Aqueduct against New York breds. He was a little overmatched, but he did have some trouble in that Westchester. And it's tough in some of those races. Repo Rocks, he was just freaky in some of them. And that was a strong group. I mean, comparing that to what we see here, obviously with Zandon and with Weyburn in there, that was a solid group. Really no knocks on him. And with the connections alone with Brown and Irad Ortiz Jr., I think he's obviously a player.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with Dr. Ardito and Wheel and Springs as well is just they just feel like horses that might have a ceiling. And I think that they're both going to need Gunite to not run his best race to win. And that certainly could happen. I mean, we're kind of projecting that is going to happen. But we know who Dr. Ardito especially is. I mean, he's just a horse that he tries really hard. He's a game horse, but I mean, he's not the kind of horse that has this brilliant speed that's probably going to run a triple-digit buyer or some 120 plus Timeform US speed figure in this race. That's just not him. But if the race comes apart, he's going to be finishing at the end. He was 6-1 last time because American Revolution took so much money and just didn't come back the same horse that we had seen when he was younger. So that Evan Shipman just became a much easier race once that heavy favorite didn't show up. So we'll see if he's able to really step forward here. Maybe Wheeling Springs has a little more upside, just since he's gotten into the Lindsay Schultz barn, who just seems like she's turning around everything that comes into her stable. I mean, he's just been stepping forward with each and every start, and was a generous 9-1 last time in the Island when he won that race over Trademark, who's a solid runner. But that was another race that had a heavy favorite in Zozos that failed to show up, finished off the board. So, I mean, Gunite's... I think he might lose this race, but I don't think he's going to completely fall apart and not show up, because that's not who Gunite is.
And that's what we're doing in this race, too. We're talking ourselves into horses that need to step up and need to improve, and we hope that Gunite isn't going to be quite as good at the mile because, like you're saying, as we keep talking ourselves into some of these other horses, you get back to Gunite, and overall, I mean, he's just been a better horse, right? No doubt about it. He's been facing better company. We're projecting a little. And Wheeling Springs, no knocks. Like he's won 2 of the 3 races for the new barn. The loss came to Proxy, who came back to finish second, beating a nose in the Jockey Club. So that form has been good. And I like the fact that he's improved a little stretching out. We've seen him do something new, and that maybe is why he has kind of a new kind of built-in ceiling. But I agree with you. It just feels like Gunite's going to need to get softened up or just not really want to go this far. And then if that's the case, I think there are 3 or 4 other logical horses if you're playing it that way. But just know that that's kind of how we're playing it. Like if Gunite does show up with probably a B+ performance, I think he'll win this race.
Yeah, and the benefit of this being the first leg is this is the one leg in the sequence where you can sort of let value be your guide a little bit. And if Gunite is 3 to 5 with 10 minutes to post, maybe that's when you're going to put in your wager, and you can downgrade him a little bit if you feel like that's too low of a price on him. And some others could drift up a little bit. The win odds can be tough to use sometimes, especially at a venue like Parx, where you do have some of that CAW money that's forcing those late odds changes, but you can always look at the double payouts and get a better sense of where the odds are ultimately going to go.
And give a shout out, TimeformUS has for a while done projected odds. I know some of the tracks have been kind of picking that up. And with DRF now, just recently, I've been getting familiar with the all access past performances. If you're someone who uses like the classic style or the formulator style, you can purchase the TimeformUS and you can bounce back and forth between them. I think that's very helpful, David, for people that are learning the TimeformUS, because they can look at the other PPs, look at your PPs, and then compare some of the things that they might know. It'll probably make it easier to learn some other things from the TimeformUS. And the pace projectors are fantastic that everyone mentions, but we'll be seeing a lot of TimeformUS stuff on DRF, and so helpful in your handicapping. I think, as a handicapper, I know that I am much better of a handicapper. Maybe I don't win all the time as much, but I feel like I do more now than I did 5 years ago and more than I did 10 years ago. And I think each and every year, if you're not trying to add a little something to your repertoire, you're probably getting behind because other people are adding, and you want to make sure you're consistently trying to improve.
No, I totally echo those sentiments. I mean, I think there's the inclination when you're a horse player to just complain about everything that doesn't go your way. And I understand. I mean, there are some parts of this game that feel like they're stacked against you at times, especially with those late odds changes that can be very frustrating.
Takeout that we're talking about, right? Yeah.
Yes, or, don't even get us started on the jackpot wagers and stuff like that. Luckily, we don't have to really factor that in to Saturday. But I mean, the point I'm trying to make is, even when stuff doesn't go your way, there's still things to be learned about how you can play the races better to accommodate or account for those things. And as you said, the DRF projected odds are a great tool that you should use because they're available to you. And I always try to check when I'm playing a track where the projected odds are indicating, because they're based on the double payouts of the race prior, not just with the winner, but with all of the horses, including putting emphasis on the horses that took the most money in those races, where you have that sample of where the money went from the prior race, where the pool is already closed. So it's a great tool to use that you should be using if you're trying to get a sense of where the odds are ultimately going to go.
And the one thing, David, I think I can do consistently as a handicapper gambler, I can make smart wagers. I can be prepared. After that, a lot of things are out of my control. I can't control trips. I can't control weather. I can't control stewards' decisions or, traffic trouble and getting stuck and having bad trips. But I know that day in, day out, if I'm playing the races consistently, which I am from a lot of different places, I want to make sure at least I'm disciplined. I can actually be proud that and look at myself in the mirror year in, year out. That's one thing I try to do a little bit better, play into the better sequences. Like as you mentioned, the races you have a stronger opinion. And then at the end of the day, I can say, hey, I did my part. I did everything I can. I'm going to be frustrated some days with the bad beats, but I feel like I'm messing up less on things that I did myself. And, it's from learning and listening to smart and sharp people like you in this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, but I mean, I agree. You just have to. That's one of the allures of the game is that there's always something to learn, and it's incumbent upon you to keep learning. And whether you're winning or losing, there's always something to be learned from what you've done and what the results were at the races. So that is great advice. Let's get back to the handicapping and move on to race 11. This is the Gallant Bob Grade 2 event going 6 furlongs for the 3-year-olds, and there's no standout in this race like there was in the prior race, like some favorite that you're have to develop some opinion about whether you're trying to beat or not. But there are a couple of horses that are likely to take money in here, particularly the 2 that are coming out of that Hilton Stakes at Charlestown, those being Damon's Mound, the winner of that race, as well as Rivet, who was the beaten favorite, finishing off the board on that occasion. Gino, this race in the past has sometimes attracted a really talented 3-year-old sprinter or one that could be a heavy favorite. It doesn't feel like that's the case this year necessarily. Nope. Not to knock Damon's Mound or Rivet, but there are horses that have some spottier form, and I'm not going to knock anybody that wants to take a shot against either of these horses.
I am. This is going to be probably my strongest opinion in the sequence, and I'm going to on at least one ticket and one of my bigger tickets, I'll probably single right here. As you pointed out, both horses are fine. They're solid. I actually thought it was sort of strange in that race where Damon's Mound was in front of Rivet. And I think because Rivet in the last 2 races hasn't been able to get towards the lead, I feel like this is another horse who might be determined to try to get closer to the lead because the tactics from off the pace haven't worked quite as well in the last few. Not like it was his fault. He missed the break in one of them. He lost to a very nice horse, rest in peace, in New York Thunder. And then last time out at Charlestown, he was actually getting a pretty perfect trip in third, kind of loomed up at the top of the lane, and then just faded as Damon's Mound, who was getting did a little bit of the dirty work. He was sitting second and kind of battling throughout. He drew off. I'm looking at this race, David, and I'm seeing those 2 horses who I feel like will be forward. Sir Lancelot is really, really fast, and he doesn't really want to sit at all. I think he just has one way to go. The horse who I'm drawn to in here is Nautical Star, the number 5. If you just sort of look at his form overall, he's a lightly raced 3-year-old, and I just like the fact that he's got a ton of upside in here. His career debut was going 6 furlongs, just a little slow early. He was double-digit lengths out of it, and you could see him start to figure things out in the middle of that race. He ran, I think, pretty good to finish 4th there. Comes back in his second start, and very impressive wins. That's over at Oaklawn Park. He earns a nice 80 buyer speed figure early in the year in doing so. They thought enough of that race to take a swing in the Florida Derby. He was a big long shot there. He was about 40-1. I hadn't realized until looking back how live that Florida Derby has come. There were 5 next out winners out of that Florida Derby. Even more than that, there were 2 next out runner-ups. We had Forte, who was second next out in the Belmont. We had Fort Bragg, who was second next out in the Pat Day Mile. So he's in the Florida Derby, which comes back to be a very, very live race. I think it's easy to put a line right through it because it was going 1 1/8 miles. He's off for a few months. He shows back up on August the 18th, a little about a month ago at Gulfstream Park in the slop. Shows a little more tactical speed. He sits a nice trip. If I'm seeing this race on paper and it plays out that way with a lot of speed in here and horses who want to be forward, I think he's the one that sits the trip. He's got the most upside. I think he will be sort of in that 4-ish to 1 range. As you mentioned, I could see at least 2 other horses taking more money than him. And in a pick 4 or pick 5, I like finding horses like this to try to key in on. If I can single him here, it'll give me a lot of opportunity to build around in other races. I can throw in some of those in-between middle prices that I like. I'm going to take a big stand here with Nautical Star.
Yeah, he's a horse that I was sort of on the fence about when I was handicapping this race, and I still haven't quite decided which way that I want to go on him. I agree with a lot of what you said. I mean, he's a horse that showed that potential early on. I mean, the Florida Derby was just sort of a crazy spot for him, but it feels like they're starting his career over now, second off the layoff for Saffie Joseph, and he ran fine last time. I'm not going to say that I love the field that he beat that day, but it could have just been a stepping stone. And the thing that makes me afraid of this horse most of all is, I mean, if you've been paying attention to a whole variety of circuits in the past couple months, Saffie Joseph's horses are really running. I mean, you could look up stats about it. I mean, I think I pulled a stat for Mish when I was looking in the last race. Over the past 2 months, Saffie Joseph is winning all circuits at about 30% with a $2.43 ROI. So, for a top barn like that, that's sort of overperforming relative to expectations, I think that's pretty notable. And this horse just feels like he's dangerous in this spot for I mean, I'm not going to repeat everything you said, but I don't disagree. And I could see him taking some money in here, but how low can he be? 7-2, 4-1. Maybe that is the right price on him. So he's one that I definitely feel like I have to include. I might not be quite as bullish on his chances as you are, but he's not a horse that I want to leave off my tickets. I mean, between those two horses coming out of the Charlestown race, I do kind of prefer Damon's Mound because Rivet just feels like a horse that was initially cut out to be a top sprinter, and they just kept running him and running him and running him, which is Asmussen style. I mean, when these horses are in form, he's gonna get the most out of them. And it just feels like he's gone the wrong way recently. I mean, I know he didn't break well in the Amsterdam, but he just never had anything to offer that day. And then last time out, like you said, he just felt like he was a little flat every step of the way. And Damon's Mound, I mean, yes, he didn't cover quite as much ground because he was mostly in the 2-path and moving over to the rail in that race. But, I mean, that was a really fast pace that he was setting. I mean, you look up those pace figures in TimeformUS. I mean, the first quarter, 157. That's extremely fast for a 7-furlong race. And, I mean, no surprise that he got a huge pace upgrade from TimeformUS for that spot. I mean, the final time number, 103, is basically right in line with the buyer, but he got a 15-point pace upgrade to get a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. And that's about as big of a pace upgrade as you're going to see for a winner of a race. And, I mean, he also did not get the best of trips when he met Rivet in the prior race at Ellis Park, because that was a time at Ellis where maybe you wanted to be inside saving ground. Rivet got the perfect trip, and Damon's Mound was sort of reserved off the pace early. They elected to rate him that day, and he was outside chasing, not where you wanted to be. So he's maybe a horse that is a little better than some of the recent speed figures indicate. So I view Damon's Mound as way the horse to beat in this race, and if he's 4-1, I would say maybe that's better value, at least in my opinion, than a horse like Nautical Star at the same price. We'll see how the odds ultimately shake out in this race. But I was leaning more towards Damon's Mound among those short-priced runners.
Completely agree. He was the second one for me, and he'll be on a ticket or two, ones where I'm not singling Nautical Star. And like you said, he's got a little versatility to him also. Like, he can sit off. He's not a horse that needs the lead by any means, but he was very impressive in getting to the front end last time out. He's a horse who, I like horses like this where, you can go through race by race his form, and a lot of it makes sense. Like, when he doesn't have a good effort or when he's not winning races, you look last time out, he's a winner, 2 starts back. He's on a sloppy track where he's just a little bit behind. 3 back, he runs really well, going 6.5. Then he's a mile that's probably a little too far from him in a tough Pat Day mile. You go back and there's a race on the grass, even back to last year. He's in the Iroquois. That's going a little longer than he wants, and it's at the end of the year. So you can make a lot of legitimate excuses if you're doing some archaeology with him, right? You're doing a little digging with his form. I have very few problems with him in this field, and I agree with you. I prefer him to Rivet. I do think he's the horse to beat with that versatility. And, he's been a horse who's been good all along. Sometimes it's not always linear with every horse. They're not just good and they stay good. Sometimes they're precocious and then that's it. Other times it's like a roller coaster, and you just sort of have to find out the niche that a certain horse has. They tried a couple things with him. Maybe he's just a sprinter on the dirt like this, and I think that's what his past performances might suggest.
Now, I agree with you that there is quite a bit of speed in here. I mean, if the race really comes apart, are you willing to upgrade any of those long shots? I mean, I'm guessing the answer is not really, because you sound like you want a single in this race. But I mean, there are some horses that would appreciate pace. It just feels like maybe they don't possess the talent to win the race, and they're more horses that you want to use underneath if you're playing exotics in this spot.
Yeah, the one who I could try to get myself into would be the 190% Maddie. Maybe cutting back. This horse has gone a little bit longer and had some success sprinting early on in the career. I could see being fitter. I don't like the rail draw with horses like this. But of the bigger prices, if you were looking to maybe throw a horse in or underneath, I could see this horse being at least fit, cutting back from a string of 5 or 6 route races after having some success as a sprinter, and a horse who knows this track pretty well.
Yeah, I really wanted to like 90% Maddie in this race because
Same thing.
I love it. I love a turn back, and he's a horse that arguably he's run some of his better races going longer, but he had run some proficient races sprinting early in his career, and with just natural routine maturity, you could expect him to be able to run faster now. It's just his last 2 races are a little hard to reconcile because, I mean, he just didn't show up at a very short price 2 back and had nothing to offer in that Smarty Jones last time. It feels like his form's gone a little bit sour, but he does have the back races to be awfully dangerous in here, and he's going to be a price. So he's one that I would definitely want to include somewhere. He's not my main horse in here, but just given the price he's going to be, he's one that I don't want to leave out. I mean, I tried to make a case for Gordian not on the outside, but I mean, he's just a horse that feels like he's gotten good trips in his recent races, and we've seen what he is, and he would need to find a level of performance that we haven't quite seen out of him yet to beat a field like this. But he is kind of a cool local horse, so I just wanted to give him a mention.
Yeah, I probably would want a little bit more of a price if he is in that 5-1 range than what we'll get, maybe like 8-ish, because you're right, he does fit. Like, he does feel like the type of horse who could get a trip. If we're projecting this race to, look for a horse who can sit off the pace a little bit, he has some versatility to him. I don't think he won't be necessarily outrun. He has enough positional speed to where he can stay within striking range. I don't have many knocks on him overall as a horse. Probably just want a little bit better of a price on him if I was going to get outside that initial tier of, Rivet, Nautical Star, Damon's Mound, who will probably take the money. Do you see any chance of a horse like Sir Lancelot like running away? Is he fast enough? Or I wasn't sure what to do with him as a pretty one-dimensional speed horse in here.
Yeah, I think Sir Lancelot has talent. I just don't know if I really view him as a dirt horse. He just seems like he's more of a synthetic turf type. The 2 dirt races at the end of last year and the beginning of this year are just a little hard for me to get past, especially given that this is a race where he's supposed to face some early pace pressure. So to me, it was just not the right spot for a horse like him. Let's move on to the Grade 1 action. The middle leg of this sequence is race 12, the Grade 1 Cotillion, going 1 mile and a 16th on the main track for the 3-year-old fillies. And Gino, we've got the leader of the division in this race in the number 3, Pretty Mischievous. She is seeking her 4th Grade 1 victory in a row, the Kentucky Oaks winner. And she's never the kind of horse that's going to win these kinds of races by huge margins, but she just is able to gut them out, and she's versatile. She can go shorter, longer, use different kinds of running styles. She's tough to beat, but it's not like she's got some huge edge over this field if you want to take a shot against her.
And that's usually why we end up taking shots against her, because like you said, she doesn't stand out on speed figures and she doesn't really overwhelm fields. So we can always try to make cases. And keep in mind, it's so sad that we're already having to mention both New York Thunder and Maple Leaf Mel on here, but she was in that race with Maple Leaf Mel in the test where Pretty Mischievous was never going to win that race. She ended up winning that race because Maple Leaf Mel went wrong late in there. And I do think, if you based on what she's done, she's hands down the horse to beat. She's on a level above everyone else, and she's been able to do it sprinting and stretch back out. But I think if you have her above the next tier of horses, I do think there's a really fun, next tier of maybe 3 or 4 horses in here who wouldn't shock me at all, who will probably be better prices, and I think who are nice 3-year-old fillies who seem like they're heading in the right direction. The first one to start with is Ceiling Crusher, who comes out here from the West Coast, and she is really fast. She's just the type of filly who we have no idea who she's faced, how good the company she's faced, and what she will do in a race like this where she's had to ship. She'll have to be facing she probably will be facing 3 or 4 fillies in this race that are better than any one horse she's ever faced. So she'll have, a much, much tougher field in here. she did hook a pretty nice horse named Big Pond two back, who's a Calbred, and probably not a lot of people know about her nationally, but she's very honest. I think the key with Ceiling Crusher, she just wants to go. She sat a little bit off the pace, and I think they were getting, just trying to see what she could do, and Big Pond is very quick. That was not the case last time out, and I think it tipped the hand a little bit when they got Edwin Maldonado aboard, who's a very, very good speed rider. So I think with her, David, at least from a starting point and a talking point, I don't think they're shipping across country, and I don't think she's in here with Edwin Maldonado to be sitting. I think this will be an honest pace, and in the Pick-5, I have to use her just because there are versions of this race where I think she can run and hide from this field.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. She is the one to catch it here, and I think your reading of the last race is right on point, because they experimented with rating her two back, and she just it just sometimes horses just don't respond to certain tactics, and she just never got in the bridle that day. I mean, they took her off the pace early, and she just didn't run her race, and they went back to the tactics that had worked previously last time, and the rider switch was indicative of what they were going to do, and they sent her hard from the outside post position, and she was able to get over and just never looked back. And the runner-up in that race, Flying Connection, she's no slouch. She's a nice horse.
Yeah, and she's been in some big races and was a little bit better earlier on in her career, but I think she's got to be the one to catch in here. I have to kind of start with her. And, I think if she is in that 4-ish to 1 range, I think that's probably very fair value on her. I thought that, right along with her, there's a couple other very honest, sharp horses right now. A horse like Just Catherine has not done a whole lot wrong in her career. I mean, you look at her last 3 races, she was behind Sunset Louise and Sacred Wish in her first start off of a couple-month break. Sacred Wish, we just saw come back to win a turf stakes. Sunset Louise was in the middle of a 3-race win streak. Following that, she hooks Randomize, and we saw Randomize come back to win a grade 1 out of there. And in her next start, she ends up sitting a nice trip, and she could get a pretty good trip in here. She's kind of moving forward, and I have no problem with her. She's sitting next to Defining Purpose, who's also pretty honest too. She ran a really nice race behind Randomize, and she has that good tactical style where she can fall into it. So I do think you have a couple fun horses who by no means have done as much as Pretty Mischievous has, but they might be horses with some upside here in this race and maybe the next couple months of the year.
Yeah, Just Catherine is one of those horses that I liked early in the Saratoga meet. And
yep, I was waiting for the tone in your voice. I could hear it.
Runs a career best race, but loses to the eventual Alabama winner. That's just how things go sometimes. But no, I mean, she came back and
at 8 to 1, right? You were like 9 to 1 that day,
yep,
I think.
Yeah, but she came back and validated that performance last time, beating a good horse in Raging Sea, who really did take a step forward off her seasonal debut. And Just Catherine just came up the inside and ran her down. I don't know what price she's going to be in this race. I mean, 12 to 1 on the line seems just a little bit generous for a horse that has the kind of speed figures that she does coming into this race. I mean, I guess some of that's due to the connections, but I mean, this is a trainer, Jose Jimenez, that if you've been paying attention, especially in New York, he's been sending out some live runners at prices. So Just Catherine feels like she's a really interesting up-and-comer in this race that I definitely want to use somewhere. And I think you can kind of put the number 5, a Colt, in a similar category. She is a horse that I'd actually liked her a little bit in the A-Corps, but she went off at 27 to 1, and kind of ran an unusual race for her that day, in that they took her way far back early, and she made this big move around the far turn and flattened out a little bit at the end. But I mean, beaten by Pretty Mischievous at the time, that didn't seem like it was anything to sneeze at. And she came back in her last race at Monmouth, and it just seemed like the light bulb has went on with her. I mean, she was aggressive but not pulling, just always ready to do more as Fergal Lynch was rating her towards the back of the pack. And once he sort of let her get some rein around the far turn, she just reeled in those leaders and drew off like it was nothing. And that's a race that if you look at the second and third place finishers, one of them who was in here, Foggy Night, they've come back and not just validated the race, but actually flattered the performance of a Colt, by Foggy Night coming back to run an improved speed figure, winning at Parx, and Riding Pretty, the third place finisher, coming back to also win with an improved speed figure. So that feels like a legitimate race that a Colt is coming out of, and she had shown some promise early in the season, but it feels like the change in tactics has really worked out for her mentally, and she's one that I'm very afraid of in this spot. I'll be interested to see how she's bet relative to a horse like Just Catherine. Obviously, the connections are more with the Colt, going out for Chad Brown with the Route Ortiz up, but I think that they're both very interesting in this race, especially if some pace develops on the front end, which feels like it's very possible. I mean, you mentioned the tactics that we're likely to see from Ceiling Crusher, and what are we going to get from a horse like Hoosier Philly, who has run her best races when she's forward, and it feels like they have to have some intentions to get better position this time than they were able to in the Charlestown race last time. I've just never been the biggest fan of Hoosier Philly, and I'm definitely not going to jump on the bandwagon here.
Yeah, she's one of those fillies that I think was a little precocious and maybe a little ahead of everyone early on, and she just hasn't been able to take a step forward. And you can even really see it just looking at her speed figures, right? She just really has not improved all that much from when she was one of the better 2-year-olds. The Black Eyed Susan was her best speed figure race where she got things her own way, and she beat a nice horse in Wet Paint, who's one of the best 3-year-old fillies in the Monomoy Girl. They were going so slow that day. And again, I just don't think she's as fast as Ceiling Crusher. And does she end up in chase mode in here? Could she fall into a nice trip if maybe she's sitting second or third behind the speed stops and she's right there? Yeah, sure. I like others more in here. And I totally agreed with you on a Colt too. It does feel like there are, 3 or 4 kind of fun horses if you want to go against Pretty Mischievous who are trending in the right direction. I think a Colt is definitely one of them. She was a horse who I had on some tickets in that Acorn as well. Wasn't quite as bad as it may have, or you may have felt early on when she was way out of it. And like you said, you're watching her in her races visually. It felt like, wow, maybe the light bulb went on for her and she's maturing and growing up a little bit more. If she can just be a little more handy in here and when asked, just go. I think she has a major chance in here, and her speed figures are not that far off some of the others who have run a little faster than her early on. She's going to be on Pick-5 tickets for me, David.
Yeah, I was kind of leaning towards those 2 horses drawn in the middle, a Colt and Just Catherine, and we're not going to be able to see the win prices, obviously, when we're constructing a Pick-5 wager, but I kind of, if they're bet along the lines of the morning line, I would probably have to upgrade Just Catherine because I don't think she deserves to be double digits in a race like this. A Colt she's not going to be favored, and I feel like she is a horse that's just really moving in the right direction. I was so impressed by her last race, and she's one that I have to use. I feel like she is probably the second most likely winner of the race, in my opinion, after Pretty Mischievous, who we're probably being a little dismissive of. I mean, we kind of skipped over her a little bit, and I do want to mention her again, but I mean, she is the most likely winner of this race. It's just, given all her accomplishments and her reputation, she's going to take a lot of money in here, and I think you have to keep an open mind with regard to horses that you might think are the second or third most likely winners, but are going to be the right prices based on your theoretical value line, or maybe a value line that you actually sat down and made. I mean, I think you have to do that in these races, and I just thought a Colt and Just Catherine would be the right prices based on my opinion in here. So I wanted to upgrade the 2 of them. And the thing with Pretty Mischievous, Gino, is that she's won these races and she just keeps getting it done. But you look back at those 3 Grade 1 wins, and she beat Gambling Girl by a neck, she beat Dorth Vader by a head, and she beat Clearly Unhinged by a head. And when you phrase it that way, it just sounds a lot less impressive. I mean, I know those were Grade 1 races, but the form of those races, I mean, there have been some decent runbacks, a Colt being one of them out of the Acorn. But in general, each of those races just has been a little flat in terms of the quality based on what we thought coming into the race and how it actually panned out.
Maybe like 1 or 2 of the horses in those races didn't show up, right, or fire their best races, and you're absolutely right. So we do this as gamblers, right? We don't want to knock a horse like this for her resume, but as a gambler, we want to try to line up sometimes and bet where we can find value. I agree with you. You point out a lot of these horses, a Colt makes the 3rd start of the form cycle where you think just little things could take another small step forward here. So definitely a couple in the middle that are on the radar for me. We didn't really talk about Defining Purpose, who has some good races, but she's like at a price like this, she's not, to me, a fun horse to play at a shorter price. She's sort of an intriguing horse when she's a little bit bigger. You could see, even in her last race, on paper, there wasn't that much speed, and that's why Randomized ran so well, and she got a pretty nice trip. The race came back strong, but she was in it, and she kind of moved into it late. I think the cutback will help her. She makes her 3rd start off the layoff. For me, it was just like others a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those races where you do want to have an opinion of where you think the prices are going to go, because, I mean, Defining Purpose, though she's 4-1 on the line, I could easily see her drifting up to 7 or 8-1. I mean, she's just that kind of horse. I mean, she doesn't have the sexy look that a few others in this race do, and she's not a horse that typically takes that much money. My problem with Defining Purpose is she generally gets really good trips when she's successful, and maybe she'll get a good trip here, but just given some of the pace that's signed on and the fact that she's been with the flow in a few recent races, I thought that she'd maybe be a little more against it than she's been in some recent races on the chase behind Ceiling Crusher in the early stages. So even at 7-1, I'd probably want to downgrade her a little bit compared to some others at similar prices. So she wasn't exactly for me in this race, but she's a horse that I've been wrong about in the past.
Yeah, wanted to mention her coming off that good effort, but I could agree with you in seeing the prices between her and Just Catherine maybe even out a little bit. Some of the money kind of shift between the two of them, and she floats up a little bit because, yeah, this is a fun race. The Cotillion, I really did have a good time handicapping this race and seeing the way it could play out with some of these different possibilities. And Pretty Mischievous is the one to beat. She's been very, very good all throughout the year. Brendan Walsh has done a fantastic job with her.
Now, the featured grade 1 on this card is, of course, the Pennsylvania Derby, race 13, mile and an eighth for the 3-year-olds. And, it's not the best Pennsylvania Derby field that we've ever seen in terms of attracting the top 3-year-old talent in the country. I mean, the leaders of the division just aren't in this race this year. But we do have a pretty intriguing matchup of some horses that have shown talent at different points, some runners with upside that could be coming into this race in solid form. And also horses that really have questions to answer, and among those is the number 3 Saudi Crown, who I know he's not favored on the line, but I just feel like he's a horse that has to be the favorite in this, and substantially so. I mean, I'd be surprised if he's higher than 2-1 in this race, just based on the speed figures and the company lines coming in here. I mean, Brad Cox, it just feels like he's a horse that has to be short in here. But what do you make of those two gigantic speed figures that he earned in the Dwyer and the Jim Dandy? Because I think we do have to point out that the two horses that nosed him out at the wire both came back to disappoint in their next starts.
Yeah, so as you pointed out, I mean, he's obviously the horse to beat. He's the horse who's going to take money. And I think, I mean, if we're looking at this as there are two horses that will take money, I prefer him to Reincarnate. I think he's just a better horse than Reincarnate, but you're absolutely right. To me, he's not a standout, cinch, single, and just move along. In particular, what I'm concerned about, too, is with his running style recently stretching out, he showed speed. Now, early on in his career, he sat off sprinting. I don't think that's the type of trip he wants in here. And I could see there being at least one or two others making him work. Right next door, Magic Tap hasn't been as fast as him early, but Magic Tap, I don't think, wants to be too far out of it. And even to the outside, we talked about Reincarnate. I don't think he wants to be, hooked really, really wide in here. So I'd imagine they'll try to be forward with him. So I could see even one or two others in here trying to push the pace. Scotland, to me, is the real key to the race, tactically, with what they choose to do. And I think because of his versatility, David, he's a must-use for me, and I might lean towards him as like a top selection, but he's definitely going to be a horse who's in the Pick-5 for me, because I think Scotland has enough speed to stay in range if a horse like Saudi Crown's able to sneak away. But if they do go quick enough where he has to take back, he's shown that he has no problem sitting off. And I think last time out, he's in the Travers. They seemed pretty intent on wanting to get the lead with him. And he faced a good group. He faced some of the better 3-year-olds there. And going 1.25 miles might have just been a little bit too far. He didn't run that poorly that day. He's definitely a horse that's going to be in the mix for me in here with a few others. But Scotland, no doubt about it, I think has some versatility to adapt to whatever the trip might be in this race.
In terms of Saudi Crown, I mean, so the way I was kind of viewing this race is that he's going to be 7-5. And I don't really think he's 40% or more to win this race. I mean, I don't think this horse is a true 1.1 mile type. I mean, he might just be more naturally talented than the rest in this field, and that's likely the case. But, if he was going to win a race going this distance, I thought it was going to be the Jim Dandy, when he just had the race basically gift wrapped to him, everything his own way on the front end, and he got run down by Forte. And you could say Forte is better than anything that's in this field, and that's probably fair. And even Desarb, who was further back that day, I mean, he obviously came back and ran a huge race in the Travers, even though Forte disappointed next time. So, I mean, the form lines out of the Jim Dandy go both ways. I just wonder if this is ultimately going to be a horse that wants to do this. So with some projected pace pressure in here and the fact that he's going to be a short price and drawing inside, they kind of are forced to go forward with him and use him likely more than they had to last time in the Jim Dandy in the early stages of this race. So I'm a little bit wary of Saudi Crown. And even looking back at that Dwyer, I mean, it's sort of the second year in a row the Dwyer has gotten this huge speed figure, and kind of a speed figure that I think we're waiting for some confirmation of. I mean, Fort Bragg came back and was terrible last time in the A Challenge Jerkin. So Saudi Crown is good. I just don't think he's going to offer value in terms of my opinion on him in this race. So I wanted to look elsewhere. Reincarnate is a tough call for me because his form on paper, it looks inferior, and I get the people that are just saying it's ridiculous that he's even the morning line favorite in this race. I mean, Bob Baffert doesn't hold that much power. I mean, what I will say about Reincarnate is that if you watch the workouts coming into this race, which you can do, of course, on XBTV, this is a horse that feels like he's training differently than he has in the past.
And we see Baffert's done this a lot with horses through the years where he's gotten them to develop, change maybe their tactics a little bit or the way he's trained them, and they looked like different horses, later in the year. Like we could see them physically develop and mature.
Yeah, and I think you want to be aware of that when you're evaluating workouts. I mean, it's one thing to watch a workout on one day with no prior knowledge of the horse and say, oh, that looks great. But it's another thing to know how a horse has been working in the past and compare to how the horse was doing maybe, 4 or 6 months ago. And if you remember going back to the Triple Crown Trail, I mean, I remember watching every one of this horse's workouts going back to the Triple Crown season. And he was never a horse that trained that forwardly in the morning. He was sort of this big lumbering horse that was often happy to sort of be second best in his workouts, having to be asked more than his stablemates. And something has happened since that Los Alamitos Derby where he is just he's just training out of his skin in the morning. I mean, there was a workout going back to August 11th where he was in company with Arabian Lion, and I mean, just kind of was going so much easier than that foe, who's typically a really good workhorse in the morning. And it was just a different Reincarnate, and he sort of held that form in his workouts ever since then. And obviously those aren't races, they're just workouts in the morning, but I think they can be indicative of what to expect, especially for a trainer like Bob Baffert, who works his horses pretty aggressively in the mornings, and they typically do tip their hand about how they're going to run in the afternoon based on how they're doing in those morning preparations. So,
and there's nobody, as like you mentioned with Saudi Crown, while he's been very good and he's earned a couple speed figures, there's just nobody in here that scares you. Right. There's none of the top 3-year-olds. So to see a little improvement on the speed figures from Reincarnate in this type of a race where he got the better of this group, I mean, it really would not shock at all. And so we're talking ourselves into some of these more later developing horses, but he's got as good of a resume and probably better resume than just about everyone in here.
Yeah, I mean, he was a good horse back in the spring, and his Rebel was a solid effort with some trouble, and obviously he disappointed a little bit in the Arkansas Derby and the Kentucky Derby, but I mean, he was a commanding winner last time at Los Al. I know the race didn't get much of a figure, and Skinner came back and ran just okay in the Pacific Classic, but I mean, was a decent fifth and actually improved his speed figure in that race. So, I mean, what I'm getting at is I think Reincarnate's going to run. I think he's going to run really well in this race. And he's not a horse that I'm inclined to love based on the form. I just sort of get the vibe that this is a horse I'm not supposed to be against in here. And I don't think he's going to be the favorite. I think he's probably going to be the second choice. So I'm not going to take some big stand against him. In terms of the others, you mentioned Scotland, who... Yeah, I just thought the Travers was maybe the wrong race for him, so I don't want to be too hard on him for that effort, and he just kind of fell into the lead that day. I kind of agree with what I think you're getting at, that maybe they change up the style here, and they're comfortable coming from off the pace, because he's done that proficiently in the past. I mean, he was a horse that previously had liked to target, so I think getting back to that kind of style might work for him.
And he's just not as fast, right, as the others in here, so I think by default, he just won't be on the lead with the horse like Saudi Crown in here.
Yeah, he's another one that I still don't know if he really wants these longer route distances, but I think he does make some sense in here. He's going to be a better price relative to the rest of the field than he was last time at the Travers when he was kind of a ridiculous 7-1. What do you make of a horse like Magic Tap, who is another one of these improving sorts, later developing types, who might be getting good at the right time?
Yeah, he comes out of that same race with Dreamlike, and Magic Tap and Film Star were the top two early in that race, and they sort of separated. Dreamlike was your heavy favorite. He missed the break. He was actually a horse who was took a lot of money in the wood. Also, I don't really have too many knocks on the two of them. I'm curious the trip with Magic Tap. He felt like he kind of fell into the win. He's previously been defeated by Saudi Crown. That was in their first race. That was sprinting, so tough to really even get a gauge for it. It feels like a good spot for him. And normally I think I would look at him initially and think, oh, he doesn't really feel like he has the form to win the Pennsylvania Derby. But then you look back at this race again, the second time, like we said, and he fits. He definitely fits. And I was going to ask you about Dreamlike as well, who's a horse who's taken money a bunch in his career and actually may not take as much money here. Is he finally playable if he's a little bit of a price? So for me, I guess from a price standpoint, I actually might prefer Dreamlike a little bit more. But if you're trying to beat Saudi Crown and taking that approach, I think they're both players, and I think I'd probably want both of them along with Scotland on my Pick-5 tickets.
Yeah, I don't really like Dreamlike in this race. I mean, I get that there's maybe an argument that the track was a little speed favoring last time when he competed, but he was terrible in that spot. And it feels like maybe more of an owner decision than a trainer decision to run in this race with Dreamlike. So I'm not too enthused with his chances. But Magic Tap is a horse that I think is pretty interesting in this race. I mean, yes, he got the right kind of trip last time, but watching his last two races, both at Ellis and then at Saratoga, he's just a grinder who is really game, because he was going to lose that race decisively at Ellis, two back. I mean, he got passed by Tappett's Conquest in the stretch, and once Ferrantru really got into him, I mean, he just sort of found a second gear and was coming back to nearly win that race at the end. And sort of the same thing last time. Filmstar had snuck away from him. It looked like he was settling for second, and once Gaffalione really laid this horse down and asked him for his best, he found another gear and went after that horse and ran him down. So if he doesn't have the lead here, I'm frankly okay with it, because it feels like he's a horse that's okay having a target. He goes after a horse that's in front of him. So even if he's falling into some kind of stalking trip in the second flight, I think it might work okay for him. And he's definitely one that has the speed figure power, at least based on the last couple of races, to compete here. Because if I'm saying that a horse like Reincarnate is dangerous, who's never run as fast as Magic Tap, I can't say that this horse has to improve a lot to win this race. He's definitely one that I want to use. So kind of what I'm getting at in this race is I want to keep an open mind around Magic Tap, around Scotland, and especially around Reincarnate, who I think is going to run really well in here, and sort of downgrade Saudi Crown a little bit, because I just have a vibe that this might not be the best spot for him. And I also think he's going to be a really short price.
He'll be a very short price. And to piggyback a little bit what you were saying about Magic Tap with that race where he beat Filmstar, it didn't look like he was going to win that race. He does feel like a mile and an eighth type of horse who could wear you down late. Filmstar came out of that race and won a first level allowance at Saratoga, a couple of them with a 95, 98 buyer speed figures, I think, in the next couple races. So those races came back well. Yep, I have not really any knocks on him. I think I have him picked third in here, so he'll be in the mix for me in Pick-5s for sure, especially where I have a stronger opinion earlier in the sequence. I wouldn't let a horse like Magic Tap in here beat me, especially because I'm not overwhelmed by Saudi Crown or really anyone in here.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of horses in the middle of the field that we haven't mentioned that just seem a little tough to make. I know Krupe kind of figured it out last time, but he did so in a 3-horse field. I mean, he's probably going to go back to being the normal Krupe now that he's got 10 rivals to deal with. I mean, Il Miracolo, I guess, is one that we should mention, because he ran a competitive number last time in the Smarty Jones. We're not sure who's going to be riding him in this race. They haven't named a rider yet. Obviously, Louis Saez is out with injury after he piloted him last time. Have to be concerned, though, about the way that he sort of was almost bolting at the end of that race in the stretch.
Oh, it was bizarre. He's had a perfect trip, too. Just a perfect trip. Right behind a couple horses that were battling. They were going very slow, and he was just in the clear right behind. And then he strikes the front, and as soon as he hits the top of the lane, he bolts. He was way out in the middle of the track, closer to the rail with the fans saying hello to everybody. He still won that race, but I agree. I definitely didn't want to take the horses behind him because he was bolting and he was all over the place and they weren't making up much ground, but it did come back strong based on speed figures. I mean, he earned a 98 buyer speed figure in winning that race, but yeah, he's honest, and it's cool to see him get that victory because he's been a horse who was in some of the bigger races down in Florida earlier this year. I think he was in all of those 3-year-old Florida preps, from the Mucho Macho Man to the Holy Bull, the Fountain of Youth, and the Florida Derby. But I was trying to get to any of the outside horses, David. I've just never really thought much of Gilmore, honestly. I've never been all that high on him. I guess if it was going to be one of the bigger prices, I could see him he at least has a race or two that are good enough to compete here. But I've never really been that high on him all that much.
Yeah, and it sort of feels like that Woody Stevens speed figure has not really held up to run backs. So he's kind of standing on one leg with that race, and when you take that away, it's a little tougher to make a case for him. So I kind of agree. The logical types seem like where it's at, but there could be some value among those if you have an opinion against one of the favorites, like it sounds like we do a little bit with Saudi Crown. Let's move on to the last leg of this sequence, and boy, it doesn't get much easier as we proceed on to this optional claiming race that closes things out. Race 14 has a 14-horse field. 6 furlongs for the fillies and mares. A few in for the $16,000 tag, but a lot of them in for the N1X condition, and a lot of ways to go in this race. I'll just kind of say off the bat, Gino, that this is a race where, look, I've had to make the morning line for days like this where you've got to get it done really quickly, and they want to put it in print and get it out there. And, races like this, you put a lot of effort into the stakes races and get to the last race of the day and just are like, I want to be done with this. Let's just scribble something down. The line in this race seems a little topsy-turvy, and I would probably just disregard it. So some of the horses towards the inside that are shorter prices, I don't think are going to be shorter prices. So let's just kind of throw that out the window. The horse to beat in this race, I would say, is probably the number 9, Wicked Sight, who is just kind of sticks out because there's a lot of horses in this race that have run 20, 30, 40 times, and she's more of a lightly raced type. She's run well in all 3 of her starts. She's going out for a dangerous barn at Parx, Lewis Linder, and her last race, if you've watched it, which I'm assuming you have, you'll notice that the running line is incorrect. She was never up by 5 lengths. She was sort of in a duel with the leaders, and I guess that's something maybe they'll correct if someone reports to Equibase, but that's, the running line's wrong last time, but that was also just a tougher field. I mean, the winner of that race is a nice horse, as is the runner-up, and even prior to that, I mean, she had finished ahead of Girl Trouble, who's a decent Pennsylvania-bred 3-year-old. She's just a horse that makes a lot of sense in here.
Yeah, her and the horse right next to her, the 10, were the 2 for me that I think I needed in this race to close things out. Wicked Sight, her form line, it reminds me a little bit of a harness horse when you sort of look at what she's done in her 3 races. I think I saw you out at Saratoga Harness, maybe in the summer when you went up there. Wicked Sight debuted, super impressive, just runs a field off their feet. She wins really nicely. And then in her second start, she comes back, she completely misses the break, and she breaks kind of in a bad spot afterwards. She's honestly maybe 15 lengths out of it at one point, and she starts to roll up the rail with momentum. She angles out, and in between, she just missed. It was a really good effort from way off the pace. And then a lot of times what happens is, again, she's a speedy horse, but I mentioned in harness because when you're a late racer, a lot of the times where you sort of come from out of it, then the next week they'll put you right back on the front end. And we saw her come right back to the front. She went 6.5. She'll be able to cut back. As you pointed out, she wasn't ever up by 5. She was sort of kind of gradually worked her way up to the lead. She did put away her other pace rival, which I like, but she couldn't hold off a couple horses from off the pace. This cutback should really help her. And then just based on sort of patterns and form and everything, David, I thought Glory Dia made a lot of sense in here. She was off for about 14 months from June of 2022 to August of this year. She showed back up August the 30th. She had a slow start. She was inside. She moves through some traffic pretty quickly, actually, all the way up to 3rd. She was only about 2 lengths off. She had to shift off the rail, and she was not all that far out of it. And she really wasn't asked for much late. I think the race looks a little bit better than the running line might suggest. It was a race that she needed. Her best races ever have been at Parx, and she does have races to get back to earlier on in her career. So I definitely wanted to use her closing out in the Pick-5 in the second off the long layoff situation, maybe getting back to some of her better races.
Yeah, I saw all the things that you did in that last race for Glory Dia, and I agree. I mean, she's interesting off of that trip. My issue with Glory Dia is that if you go back and watch some of her races before that, she does have a history of breaking slowly. So it's not like it just happened last time. And in a 14-horse field, that's a little bit concerning if she's going to be last away from the gate, because then you got to work out a trip from way, way back through traffic. And so that's my big concern with her, because she tends to run her best races when that doesn't happen, when she actually breaks well from the gate and can get a little more forward. And she is a horse that is a little random. I mean, she'll throw in these clunkers, and then like out of nowhere, she'll run like an 85 buyer. So I think she's run like a 90 plus buyer at different points. Yeah. So I mean, she's definitely got ability in there somewhere, but she kind of needs the gate break to work out for her from the start. So we'll see what we get from her, but she's going to be a price in here. So she's definitely one that I want to include somewhere. The number 13 Shero, I think, just makes sense in this race. She's one of those that's in for the $16,000 tag, but I don't want to hold that against her too much, because she's got plenty of form against solid optional claiming fields that are actually tougher than this. I mean, she was competing in some of those N2X races. She actually won one of them 2 back at Delaware. And then, I mean, she was in against horses like Olivia Darling and Bourbon Bombay, who I think was previously undefeated. I think she started her career 5 for 5 coming into that last race. And she faced them in 2 of her last 3 starts and actually held her own 3 back. And then last time was just sort of run off her feet the entire way against a better field. But I mean, she's one that
she fits really well.
Yeah, I mean, she just fits well here. And maybe you have to be a little concerned about the drop off of the poor effort last time, but she just makes sense. The horse that I was willing to take on a little bit that could take money in here is the number 1 Comedy Act, who I just didn't think was facing much last time. And I know it looks like she re-rallied a little bit in the stretch of that race, but the Winner Dream Concert just looked like she wanted to lay down at the end. I mean, she was really giving it up, more so than I thought Comedy Town was digging in.
And like you pointed out, this is a big field. She draws the rail in here. I don't think she's going to be able to choose her tactics, really. She's probably going to be forced into a faster trip early than what she wants, and she just sort of might be at the mercy of some racing luck in here with that rail draw. I think she's going to be a little bit overbet for her actual chances of winning this race, so I completely agree with you there. She was like a horse that is on the radar. You look at, whenever I do my handicapping, I kind of make my first assessment and I kind of have, horses that will be in the mix for me. And then I go back and I start formulating it and how do I want to put a ticket together? And I'm looking at her and I like a couple others more that I think might offer you a little more value. And I'm a bit concerned about the trip she gets in here.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially drawing the rail and just connections that typically take a lot of money at Parx. Jamie Ness and Ruben Silvera. I mean, it just feels like a horse that is not going to be any kind of price in this race. And some others are coming out of tougher spots. A horse that I think could be a price. I don't know if she's going to be as big as she is on the line, because she looks more logical than that to me. But the number 6 Practicality, I think, is pretty interesting. I mean, she had shown some promise early in her career at Tampa, and then caught some tough fields at Monmouth over the summer. Obviously she had no chance to be competitive chasing Granny's Connection, who's a New York bred stakes winner. And then in her next start at Monmouth, she was facing Bowl of Cherries, who was in really good form at that time for David Jacobson. And also that day, June 18th at Monmouth, feels like a day that you might not have wanted to be right down on the rail. And she was inside, glued to the rail for most of that trip, setting the pace before it just totally fell apart at the end. So that race is not as bad as it looks. And then they tried going long last time, which is not what she wants to do. They're taking the blinkers off. She just feels like a horse that has that might be in a better spot and be able to really improve on that recent form here.
No knocks on her. She's lightly raced with her upside. And I think she could even get a little bit more of a tracking trip in this race, right? Where she's going to be cutting back from a mile to 6 furlongs, second start off the short little break. So she should be a little fitter now if she needs to cut back or if she needs to sit off and with the blinkers coming off. I think those are tactics that they'll probably try for in here, where she was sitting sort of like where she was sitting in that Granny's Connection race, and just hope that, she can finish a little bit stronger now with a little more punch cutting back.
Is there anybody else maybe at a price that you wanted to highlight in this race, or were you trying to keep it a little more simple? Because this is a race where I think everyone's going to be tempted to just spread and try to, get lucky.
I think I'm definitely going to be using both the 9 and the 10. I wanted to get to the 8 mainly just because it's a cool name, and I do a lot of fine whining myself, David, but I couldn't get there. So lots of Wicked Sight and Glory Dia trying to close out for me. I'm going to throw in Shero for sure, who you mentioned. So yeah, probably lots of those 3 in the closeout leg of the Philly Big 5 for me.
Yeah, I'm going to make a push for just one more horse. The number 11 Beach Days, who is probably going to get somewhat overlooked just merely due to the connections. Lower profile barn, jockey that, doesn't win at a high rate. but this horse has nothing but competitive races. And I know she's coming out of Monmouth, mostly New Jersey bred form. But if you isolate her sprint races, they're all really competitive against this field, and she's the kind of horse that can run well when she gets paced to close into, and she just feels like a reliable horse that's going to show up and likely be in the trifecta and could be 10-1 in this race. She's one that I've got to use somewhere. I'm not saying that I love her as a winning type, but she could offer value in a sequence like the Pick-5.
It's a tough way to end a sequence where there are 5 graded stakes on the card, and I think 9 or 10 stakes overall, and they're always going to give us a race like this to end. We get the optional claimers here, first level allowance sort of condition. But yeah, I'd say it's tricky. And like you said, these are races where me as a gambler, I will try to find these types of races and purposely shorten up in the races where I think everybody's going longer. I feel like if my approach can just try to be a little different than the general public's approach, maybe I can already get an advantage just in structure. If in races where everyone's spreading and I'm shortening up a little bit, maybe that's where I can zig when everyone else zags. And you only need to do that a couple times of the year with some big scores in order to come out on top. So fingers crossed that it's another good weekend for us.
No, I think that's excellent advice for anybody playing these Pick-5 sequences. Not only is it a smarter way to play because it takes out a lot of the bulk from the sequence where you're playing some maybe lower expected value combinations on horses that you're just kind of throwing in defensively you don't really like, but also it decreases your ticket size and allows you to play more of these sequences generally in a smarter way, and playing more sequences in a smarter way as opposed to less sequences that are more expensive. That's just not the way to play that's going to be successful over time. So I think that's great advice. Now, on the last podcast I did, Gino, I got a comment from a listener that, we go back and forth, me and my co-host or Craig, and we're just, rambling on and on for an hour. And the part that he really wants to hear is at the end when we sort of give out the ticket that we're actually going to play and recap our opinions. So I'm going to try to be a little more explicit doing that this time. I'll let you go first and just kind of explain, how you might attack a sequence like this and some of the horses that you're going to be looking to key in on.
Yeah, so the 10th race is where the sequence starts in the Parx Dirt Mile. In this race, horses on my radar for sure. Dr. B, I do think Gunite is the one to beat. Probably include Wheel and Springs also in there. And then if you want to go a little deeper, depending on what your budget is, I really don't have a problem with Dr. Ardito as much. I'm cold on Nimitz class. So for me, lots of 5, 6, 7 in the Parx Dirt Mile right off the bat. And I mentioned my strongest opinion in the sequence will come in the Gallant Bob. That's going to be with the number 5 Nautical Star. So if I play a ticket where I single Nautical Star, I could really play a nice, $75, $90, $100-ish Pick-5 with that single, turning it into a Pick-4 and giving myself some opportunities to spread in other races. Because that Cotillion in the 12th race, I do want to go 3 or 4 deep in there. I do like the prospects of Ceiling Crusher, Occult. We mentioned Just Catherine, pretty mischievous, not really many knocks in there. I don't feel as bad of using a favorite with a few others because the way I've structured my ticket, I know I'm singling Nautical Star in one race. So in that race, it's not going to be all that chalky. So I'm okay keeping in 1 or 2 other short price favorites because of the structure of the ticket. The Pennsylvania Derby, we hit on some of those horses that are going to be on my radar. Scotland for sure. Definitely Magic Tap, Dreamlike. What are we going to do with Saudi Crown? David's talking me a little bit more into using Reincarnate. And again, I can use 1 or 2 others in here because of the single. Closing things out with 9, 10, and 13 as the major players for me, David.
And for me in this sequence, I think we're pretty similar in the first leg. It sounds like we're both a little bit wary of Gunite, and I would use as my main backups Dr. Ardito and Wayland Springs, or backups is probably the wrong word to use. I mean, they're 2 horses that I would want to use as A's in this leg in terms of like an ABC type discussion. Dr. B, a little less so for me, but she's a horse that I want to have on my ticket somewhere. And I'm not leaving Gunite out. There are other favorites in the sequence that I think I'm a little more against. But he's just a horse that I don't think is going to add any value to this sequence. So I don't really want to use him with some of my strongest opinions later. In the Gallant Bob, I think Damon's Mound is the horse to beat, and I would probably lean on him a little bit with Nautical Star as a backup. I'd want to downgrade Rivet. I could use 90% Maddie as like a distant backup, like a C-type horse. But I mostly want to try to get through this with those two towards the middle, Damon's Mound, and then Nautical Star to a slightly lesser extent. In the Cotillion, I'm kind of settling on Occult and Just Catherine. They're the two that I really like in this race, and I probably give preference to Occult, but I also realize that she might take more money than the other one, so I'd probably use both in equal strength. Not that I'm way against Pretty Mischievous, but kind of like the same situation with Gun. I think she's a beatable favorite who's not going to offer much value, so I want to downgrade her a little bit in the way I'm using her in this sequence. And the toughest call for me is Ceiling Crusher, who I'd probably use as more of a C type. I don't think she's the most likely winner of this race, but I do think she's going to have a significant impact on the outcome. In the Pennsylvania Derby, here's where I'm going to take a bit of a stand. I just don't love Saudi Crown in this spot, and I think I'm going to leave him off my tickets completely. I want to use Magic Tap and Reincarnate for sure. Scotland, I was a little more on the fence about, but I kind of talked myself into him a little bit. So there are the three for me in this race, and I'll probably just kind of try to get through it with those horses and leave Saudi Crown off my ticket in there. And then closing things out in this crazy finale, the horses that interest me most would be the number 6, Practicality, the number 9, Wicked Sight, who I think is the horse to beat and very logical, and the number 11, Beach Days. I think that they're the horses that I like quite a bit from their standpoint of their likeliness to win the race and also offering value. And then Glory Dia and Shiro would be the two that I'd also want to throw in that I think are either prices or just logical types that I think I'm a little less enthused about, but I just think that they're horses that you want to have somewhere on your tickets if you're spreading it all, to use that word in the last leg of this sequence. Well, Gino, it's a tough one to get through. I think the way that you're attacking it is really smart. You have an opinion, just go with it and try to slim down the ticket a little bit that way, because I think that a lot of these legs, there is that temptation to just use as many horses as possible because they're confusing races.
And then all of a sudden you add, and we're starting to play a $250 Pick-5, and we're using a lot of the logicals. And the one thing I don't worry as much about the short price horses that I don't love anymore. That was one thing when I started handicapping, and I wanted to win a lot more than I wanted to win money. I wanted to win in cash tickets more often. And that's one thing that I do try to preach quite a bit to my friends or people who go to the track and say, it's hard telling someone, hey, we don't want to win every race, right? What do you mean? Of course I want to win every race. But when it comes to approach, that approach can be very, very consistent. And David, I want to let you know, this has been the last few months. I've been doing some work with DRF, doing a little bit of social media, helping them. So I get to see a lot of the emails come in and a lot of the work. You are definitely one of the hardest workers out there. And we are coming off of a very trying Saratoga meet where how many times you had to make adjustments on selections or a horse you sent in or a write-up that you did or odds or something like that. It was very, very impressive to see how on the ball you were with all of your work constantly. And it's very appreciated, because I know when discussed, you are always discussed as on that short list of the best with making the morning lines, handicapping the races. And I think all the folks that listen to this show, like I do, we appreciate your work and Craig's work. I spoke with him too, and it seems like, as you said, he'll be back pretty soon, hopefully, knock on wood, in the next week or two. So what you guys do here week in, week out for the bettors, for people like me who appreciate the time and the effort, man, you teach us all so much. So I just wanted to give you a really nice shout out, because I've listened to the show a lot, and I even told Craig, I sent him a message. Craig, I got the call up to the big leagues, man. I'm really excited. David sent me a message, so I'll be on my A game so I can do you proud.
Well, I really appreciate all that. That's nice of you to say. And I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. Like I said, I always enjoy talking to you about the races. I mean, it's clear that you put the work in and you really try to, even when you do interviews with your guests on your podcast, you always have interesting questions to ask and are ready and prepared. And I appreciate that. So definitely give a listen to Gino's podcast. That's what she said. And this was a lot of fun. And it's been fun to have you, contribute to DRF and getting to work with you a little bit over the past few months or so. And yeah, those off the turf days, they really can drain you, because you put all the work in, you handicap the races for turf, you're right about the races for turf, you kind of know they're likely to come off, and then you have to do it all over again. But that's the nature of the beast.
And you can't help but, like, we're all human, right? That we all have that same feeling of like, oh no, right? And you just know that when you're looking at those races again, it's probably not with that same clear head where you were very excited going through those turf replays. You're sort of, like you said, you're just trying to get through it. Like, oh, I got to get these picks back in. I got to get it sent. So you already kind of feel defeated before it even starts when they come off the grass and you've done all that work.
100%. It's one of those tough things about the game, but the better you can adjust, I think the better you're going to do in the long term, because it does pay to do some of the work on those off the turf days, that's for sure.
And we'll keep fingers crossed that for Breeders' Cup out here, we won't have the weather. That's the one reason why we have this stuff out here on the West Coast, for good weather. So knock on wood that when the big races come in what, about 6 weeks now, we will at least have everything nice.
Doesn't look like we're going to be quite as lucky for Parx on Saturday, but as we said at the start, this is an all-dirt sequence, so hopefully it won't be too affected. Gino, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it, you making the time. Everybody, remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel, and I'll say I'll be doing some videos on the DRF channel this week with Dan Illman. We'll be handicapping a lot of these Parx stakes races, so make sure to check that out as we do our typical stakes previews for the weekend on there. Everybody, thanks for listening this week. We'll hope to have Craig back pretty soon next week, but I'll be back next week for the Pacecast and Forecast regardless. Everybody, thanks for listening.